So first of all, welcome to our audience, everyone who's joining us today for our very first Insta Live. We're all very excited. We're going to take a closer look at Australia's climate policies in the lead up to COP26. It's been a big week in the news. We've officially signed up to net zero emissions by 2050. Is it a big deal? Is it not? We'll get into that in just a moment. Just to repeat, this is our first Insta Live and hopefully the first of many as we give you all the opportunity to chat with us about the issues that matter. So first, some introductions. I'm Anton Issa, I'm the off-platform editor here at Guardian Australia, and joining us today are our three resident experts on all things climate change. We've got our editor-in-chief, Lenore Taylor, who has been covering climate politics in Australia for more than 3 decades. We've got Adam Morton, he is our climate and environment editor. He's been covering this for about 15 or so years, as has Graham, who is also the host of our special investigative podcast series this week, Australia versus the Climate. I've learned a lot from listening to a few episodes. I'm particularly excited about today's episode, which is about the fossil fuel industry and everything that it's done to try and keep Australia from taking meaningful action on climate change. Graham, do you want to say a few words about the podcast series and how it's been going and
sure.
What you've been doing?
We started 3 months ago. We recorded more than sort of 35 hours worth of interviews for this. It's a huge undertaking. It's a 5-part investigative podcast series. And it's really essentially looking at what has Australia done on climate at these international talks since the very first deals were being struck in Kyoto in 1997. I mean, they're at far-flung places. They're all around the world. Often you don't have sort of local media there, but they are crucial for what happens for Australia's policy and sort of for global policy and what the world does on climate. So they're really important things for us to understand, and that's what it's about. And the final episode is tomorrow.
Wow. And you can listen to all these episodes by subscribing to Full Story on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or Google Podcasts. So we asked our audience in the lead up to this Insta Live to submit some questions that you all had about Australia's climate policies. There were many very interesting and smart questions. We've cut down a few. I apologize in advance if we don't get to your question, but hopefully we cover all the points that you all wish to know. So I'll kick off with Lenore. I'll ask you this question to get things started. Let's talk about 2050 net zero. Is 2050 too late for zero emissions? And if it is, what year should we be aiming for?
Well, in some respects, yes, but it's a target. It is an ultimate endpoint. And what's really important is what happens between now and then, how we get there. And I think it's probably a more useful way of thinking it is to calculate a carbon budget, like how much can we emit and keep global heating below 2 degrees, which is the sort of the outer limit of what scientists say we can possibly manage ecologically or, for human civilization. At the moment, what governments are promising to do is at 2.7 degrees. So, and that's if they do what they promise, which, often governments don't. So really what is most important is what we do in the short term on the path to net zero by 2050. And that's why this Glasgow meeting next week is about what governments do by 2030, what they do right now. Because if we just keep emitting and then think we're somehow going to get there in the last couple of years before 2050, obviously that carbon budget will be all used up, and obviously global heating will exceed, what we can withstand. So as a ultimate endpoint, sure, it's important, but it's not the most important thing. The most important thing is what we do now.
Right. And so the plan that was released this week, Adam, Graham, feel free to jump in as well. The plan that was released this week, does that put us on a path to keeping the temperatures below 2 degrees? Is it sufficient?
No, this is exactly what's wrong with it. It is banking all the government's hopes on technologies, many of them not yet developed or not yet fully functioning, that will somehow kick in right at the end of that time frame and get us to a 2050 target, while we don't do very much more at all in the next decade. That's precisely what is problematic about the government's about the government's policy, and also the fact that in the meantime they're continuing to exploit fossil fuels, open up new gas exploitation basins, open up new or expand coal mines. You know, in many ways they're sort of going in the wrong direction in the short term, but still claiming somehow we're going to get to the right direction in the long term.
Right. And you've written a bit about, go ahead.
Sorry, Anton. Look, I mean, I think a way to think about it is that it assumes technology will get us there. The government's putting some, not that much on a global scale, money into technology development. And the document basically is a black box that assumes technology arrives from here and from overseas about 2040 on, and will get us to net zero much closer to that date when, as Lenore said, all the science tells us that what matters really is making really deep cuts this decade. The government's not planning to do that. And there's no new policies here. There's nothing new to change the direction. It's just the idea that we'll get technology, eventually it'll become cheaper and people will start using it. It's basically that simple.
Right. So we received a few political questions to get, I think, into the, the backstory behind this. So one I'll ask is that we got from an audience member: is the stalling on climate policy due to self-serving political interests? If so, how do we stop it?
Yeah, pretty much. My short answer is yes. How do we stop it? Look, decarbonising the economy is an opportunity. It is the right thing to do for the environment. It's also the right thing to do for our economic future, for our well-being. And this isn't a somehow sort of far-fetched idea now. The Business Council of Australia sees it that way. Leading economists see it that way. You know, major investors see it that way. The economist Ross Garnaut wrote a whole book about how Australia could become a clean energy superpower. So that opportunity is being entirely masked in Australia by the fact that politicians are weaponising climate change because it does involve some change to how we do things. Tony Abbott sort of paved the way for the weaponisation of climate policy when he called it the great big tax on everything. And we saw after he was out of office, his then Chief of Staff, Peter Credlin, admitted that they knew that the emissions trading scheme was not a carbon tax and that they'd really been about brutal retail politics. So I think the sad truth for Australia is that what could be a real advantage, what could be an enormous opportunity, is being thwarted by short-term political opportunism. And I think that's, I think it's a real shame.
A part B to that question that we got also from the audience is looking at the dichotomy in Australian politics between, opposition and government. How much of that is that to blame for the current government not supporting science and reason?
I think that.
So you go, Graham.
Yeah, I was just going to say that what we've seen emerge over the last few decades, particularly out of think tanks in the United States, many of them funded with help from the fossil fuel industry, is to set up this sort of this continuing debate over the science when the debate wasn't really there. And then if it's not over the science, it's about how doing all these, our renewable energy will be ruinous, it will kill our economy. It's exactly the language we've seen in the last few days. There's been a lot of work, deliberately, I would say, to polarize the public. And a lot of that work has bled into the Australian sort of particular conservative space, and it's created this politicization of the issue. Interestingly, in the podcast, we spoke to Connie Hedegaard, who was the Danish environment minister. This part didn't make the series, but they have a lot of gas there. They have a lot of lobbyists. And I said, how come you didn't have the problem in moving towards stopping gas exploration and getting to net zero? And she said, we all thought it was important. And it was kind of as simple as that, and it blew my mind. But that speaks to the difficulty of the politicization of it here, and that politicization has not happened by accident.
Right.
No,
I don't want to add to that.
If by dichotomy the questioner means that two-party political system, then I think to an extent that is an issue. I think there are MPs who are nervous about the electoral implications of change in particular regions and particular places in both of the major parties. And one way we've seen in the past that their voices have been less influential in the major party was when Julia Gillard was presiding over a minority government, and doing something on climate change was actually, a condition of forming government, but from the Independents and the Greens. And that was when the ETS got passed. It was later repealed, but that was how it got passed. So I think that's the calculation of many of the groups that are trying to get sort of climate-minded independents elected at the next election, that if that kind of balance of power situation can be engineered again, then that could form quite a powerful force, whichever major party it is in government. Because, doing things about global heating is not a left-right issue. It is not an ideological issue. And around the world, there are many conservative governments who are taking action which will be sort of unthinkable for either major party in Australia. So if that's what the question meant by dichotomy, then I think it's a good question.
Well, to follow up to that, is this the upcoming election, is this the election where we'll see independents maybe taking a few more seats? Do you see that kind of shift happening to hold a balance of power, or at least deny a clear majority from either party?
Well, it's difficult to say. I mean, there was a sense that might have happened in the last election, and it didn't, to the extent that many of those who were sort of lobbying and pushing for it to happen, had hoped. I think it depends on a lot of other factors as well, because, there are many issues that go into forming someone's voting intention.
And there's another question around politics. Speaking of coalitions, what is the chance of a Labor-Greens coalition? And if they're elected, will that be enough to combat the climate crisis?
Feels like a very 2010 sort of question, Anton. Back to the future. Lenore should answer that first, though, I think.
I guess I would say it depends what you mean by a coalition. I think close ties are unlikely. We all know there is a sort of historical animosity between the Greens and the Labor, largely bedded in previous decisions that each have made around climate policy, and probably too detailed to go into right here. So I think they would have differing views about the level of ambition for a climate policy. But if what we're saying is that, we're envisaging a future where maybe Labor won and they were negotiating with the Greens about a climate policy, then, I think it's possible that a reasonable policy could come from that. But anything sort of more formal than that in terms of coalition is highly unlikely. And also, for raw political reasons, those parties need product differentiation.
Yeah. Right.
I don't know if Adam and Graham have other views about that.
No, I mean, I agree. I don't see a coalition. I think there's, not in a formal sense, that's almost impossible to imagine. But I do think that, and a parliament that has a Labor, Greens, Independents mix, trying to find some sort of middle ground, would obviously be different to what we've seen this week. Though we should say that while Labor is more ambitious than the coalition on climate and has made some noises about some policy areas related to jobs in clean industries, we really haven't seen a lot of what they would do yet. I think we could reasonably assume they'd be more ambitious than what we've seen this week, but we haven't seen any detail. And that'll be a big question for the next few months.
Right. There were a few questions around economic policy and specifically energy policy. One is, why is Australia so reliant on coal when most countries are moving away from it?
Because we have so much of it, basically. We have a huge amount of what has been considered historically really cheap coal right across the country, particularly up the eastern seaboard. And we've benefited from that historically because it's given us cheap power and we've built a lot of industry on that. But we haven't factored in the cost of the greenhouse gas emissions that come from it that do have an impact, which we know. We did for 2 years when we had a carbon price briefly, but then we got rid of that and we still don't. So, we have a really strong historical connection to that, and that has become within our political debate, and for a lot of people, a source of identity, I think, which, we find very hard to move away from. Yeah.
Well, speaking of moving away, another question that relates to that is, what are the practical means of phasing out fossil fuel energy, so our reliance on coal, and phasing in renewables? What does that actually look like? We talk about climate action, but what does that actually mean for us to transition to a clean energy system?
Who's going to take
it means cleaner air. It means batteries, big ones. It means also batteries that look a bit like dams, like snowy hydro. It means being a lot more efficient in how we use energy. But it's a choice that we either say, yes, we agree with the Paris deal and we do the work to get it done, or we keep using coal. And we can't have both. The transition looks to me anyway, like less massive holes in the ground, cleaner air, and lots of big batteries, and way more efficient use of the energy that we do have. It's a simple thing, actually. It's burn a lot less fossil fuels and use a lot more renewables.
Yeah,
but I think it also requires an acknowledgement that it does mean a transition for communities and for workers that needs to be taken really seriously. There are whole towns and whole regions that have had their economic foundations in coal mining for a really long time. The fortunate thing, if you were looking at this as an opportunity, which I think we should be, is that they are oftentimes in exactly the same regions, which are totally prospective as renewable energy hubs and renewable energy areas, and where the whole clean manufacturing prospect for Australia could be based. But that requires some political will, and it also requires a lot of attention to those people who have, quite genuine concerns and fears that need to be taken seriously.
That's absolutely true. Could I just like to add to that? I think we should say that that making this transition would not be easy, will not be easy. There are, big challenges in it, but there is really serious work that's been done that shows that is achievable, and a lot of it is achievable with existing technology. In terms of electricity, solar and wind are the cheapest forms of electricity available. And even the government's document this week suggested that that emissions from electricity would be cut by about 97% by mid-century. So they're expecting that we're going to be running on clean electricity. It exists now. And there are paths out there. There are reports out there, including government documents, that set a path under which fossil fuels could be replaced. There are some areas that are more tricky than others, but that solar and wind and electricity backed by batteries and pump hydro storage, which Graham mentioned, could do a lot of this work. But what it requires is policy to make that shift. It won't, it's happening gradually at the moment, but we need government to drive that. And at the moment, it's happening a little bit at state level, but it's not happening at federal level.
Well, both you and Lenore partly answered this question, but I'll bring it up anyway, because this is, a key topic that obviously, we hear a lot from, especially Nationals, the National Party. How can Australia achieve net zero without everyone in mining losing jobs? So on top of the policy, obviously that it has to include significant investment to get these communities out of their current, dependence on mining towards what Lenore was saying before, ample opportunity to work in renewable energy hubs.
Well, to start with, it's not all mining, and in fact, there's some mines of rare earths and minerals that will be more necessary in the future, which Australia can expand. So but they're not necessarily in the same places. So it's not all mining that needs to be sort of transitioned away from. And I think it does require proper transition plans in the areas where coal mining will over time diminish. But this isn't also something that's going to happen overnight. It's not a tomorrow question. There is time to make the transition. Would have been a lot more time to make the transition if we'd started, back before the carbon laws. But anyway, there is still time to make the transition. As I said before, I think it's something that needs to be taken very, very seriously, because, those people who work in those industries have legitimate concerns that need to be addressed.
Can states do this without the federal government? Sorry, Adam, I just want to can states do this without the federal government taking leadership on this?
To some extent, and they are. I think the transition that's happening in electricity generation to date is largely, well, it's partly previous federal government policies in terms of renewable energy targets, but it's mostly state government action that's happened and investors taking the lead. But the big problem when federal policy is uncertain and unclear and ill-formed as it is right now is the effect it has on investor confidence. There's a lot of money wanting to invest in clean energy right now. There's a lot of money wanting to invest in carbon offsets right now. But those investors, those funds, need to have confidence that there's stable, sensible policy at a federal level in order to make those investments. I think that's the biggest impediment, the biggest problem with the sort of non-policy that we saw this week.
Right. Adam, you wanted to add to that?
Just to circle back on the last one, if that's all right, I just want to say that we know, I agree with everything Lenore said, but we know there are industries in which Australia, and again, there's been serious work that's been done. Lenore mentioned Ross Garno's book last year. It's a really important work by a group called Climate Works Australia that's talked about what's possible and which industries could grow. We have resources that could be really important in a zero emissions world. We have a lot of lithium, for example, that is important in batteries. We have great capacity to develop renewable hydrogen, which is going to be an important source of energy potentially. Green steel made with renewable energy is now a live possibility. We just have to make it affordable, but it's already been produced in very small scale in Germany. That's where the transition means moving from the polluting industries that we have in the regions to these sort of opportunities. But in terms of, I agree that states can do so much, but and they are to some extent, but the national government does need to
take leadership. Right. Yeah.
There's also the risk of losing jobs from other parts of the economy if we don't act as a genuine force for good on the international stage. I mean, you look at how many jobs, for example, a healthy Great Barrier Reef supports. 60-odd thousand, I think, is the number. That's from some modelling a few years ago. Now, we know that the reef is at grave risk. If you can't really sell an international tourism industry on the back of a reef where there's almost no coral and it's dominated by algae. We talk about losing jobs in mining, but we can also, which is never a loss, it's a transition. People move around, but we could also risk losing jobs as our tourism assets become much less of a draw card for international visitors.
Right. I've got a question with regards to media. Why doesn't the media report on state-level climate policies? Do we report on state-level climate policies?
I'm not sure that's entirely true. We do. Lenore's going to tell us about our new network ongoing in Australia.
Well, I could talk about that a bit. We are setting up state-based, state bureaus early next year, which will help. But I think we do, to an extent already, report on state policies. Certainly we've reported on the New South Wales renewable energy push lately, which is quite significant. But yeah, we'll probably be doing more of it next year.
Right. Yeah, I just want to point.
The metropolitan papers. The metropolitan papers cover it, but of course the metropolitan papers in Australia are dominated by a company that doesn't own the Guardian, and so often we do hear about climate policies in metropolitan papers, but often it's framed in a really sort of politically charged way. That's been happening for a long time. And it's framed around politics, it's framed around the interests of sort of big emitters and mining corporations. And so I think that maybe the person that's asking that is maybe also hinting that at a state-based level, all of the state governments are now well ahead in terms of targets than the federal government.
Right. So we're approaching our 30-minute mark. So I want to just ask a few closing questions, really interesting questions that we got from our audience. We get this a lot. When we post on Instagram climate stories, we often get comments from people who are frustrated, just asking what more they can do to try and push, as citizens, to push governments, federal and state, to do more on climate change. So we had a bunch again come through when we put a call out the other day. So So I'll let all of you answer this question. What more can people, apart from voting in elections, what can each person do to impact climate policy in Australia?
I would say voting is the most important thing that people can do. Voting and lobbying inside whatever party fits their personal political views. Because, as I said earlier, this is not a left-right issue. It's not an ideological issue. It shouldn't be. And I think, as well as voting, purchasing power is important. So choosing the green electricity option, choosing a climate-friendly superannuation fund. So you're using, your small purchasing power as an individual to try to shift where capital goes. And then there are all the small changes that we all know we can make in our lives. And they are important. They really are. But it's those bigger things that will make structural changes that I think will have a much bigger effect, are much more important to get the sort of dramatic and rapid action that the world really needs.
I would say just talk about it. Talk about climate change. Make it part of your everyday conversation. That flows out to then the desire to, we want to vote when we learn about things and we realise everybody's worried about this, because people are. So just talk about it.
Right.
Yeah. I can't add much to that other than what I was going to say less articulately is, yes, voting matters, and be engaged. And I guess that is a similar thing to what Graham said. If you are, it takes effort, but if you are conscious of what is happening and using it to inform the decisions you make in your life, then if we're doing that enough on scale, that's how change accelerates, I would say.
And I guess last word, engage in the detail of it, not in the issue as a sort of political horse race, which is how it's often portrayed in Australia. And I think that's a large part of why we're in the mess we're in.
Absolutely, 100 times. Let's talk about it less. Let's think about it less as just politics. The politics matters, but the politics should come from the fact that we are all engaged with what is required rather than, which team's doing what or backing which team.
You're all parents, so maybe you can give some insight to this question. What do you say to a younger generation that may not have time to make a difference?
I think every molecule of CO2 avoided makes a difference. What gives me hope is, my daughter, when she was about 10, just a few years ago, we had a federal government federal election, and she forced me to walk with her down to the bottom of the street where there was a Liberal MP doing a little sit down with local people. And she sat down with this prospective candidate for about half an hour, asking her about coal, asking her about the Great Barrier Reef. And what gives me hope is that as we were walking back, she turned to me and she just said, she was lying to me, wasn't she? So what gives me hope is that people are the younger generation are way more savvy about this, I think, than we often, us old folk, give them credit for.
Yeah, I would add to that. We're gonna hear a lot of stories, and they're going to be, a lot of accurate stories over the next couple of weeks while this big summit's happening in Glasgow about how far short the world is from where it needs to be, and that's true. But and I don't make light of that at all. I'm sure I'll be writing them as well. But we also should recognise that there has been a shift in the last couple of years that is some cause for optimism and may accelerate. We've now the big money internationally, increasingly, not absolutely, but more and more is headed towards clean solutions. A lot of big business now thinks that net zero is where the world is headed. It's going to be a messy ride, no doubt, but that is where they're looking to put their money. That wasn't the case just a couple of years ago. That wasn't the case when the big global Paris climate deal was signed in 2015 in the same way. So we are seeing change. It needs to be much faster, but there has been a shift on in the last couple of years. And also, if you see the enthusiasm from younger generations who are concerned about that issue, has been a big part of that too, I think, with Greta Thunberg's movement and the Strike for Climate movement. you know, I think there's reason for some optimism about an acceleration ahead.
And just really
might think it'll
quickly,
be enough, but it will be. Yeah.
just really quickly, I do also take hope from the next generations, and I think it's really important to echo what Adam's saying, that we convey hope. It is still possible to do something about this, and I think it's really important that we don't paint it as being hopeless.
Well, thank you. Well, you all pretty much answered the next question, which was what's been the thing that's made you most hopeful in the last 10 years re climate politics? So anything else you guys want to add before we close out? We are good. Well, thank you, everyone. And just a reminder that you can listen to our investigative podcast series by looking up Full Story on Spotify, Google Podcasts, or Apple Podcasts. Thank you, everyone, for submitting questions. Thank you, guys, for giving your time today. And let's keep doing our jobs, right?
Thank you.
Thanks, Anton.
Thanks, everyone.
See you. Bye.